Hi everyone, my name is Melissa Williams and I am our nursing coordinator in the Center for Student Success at the college. So you've heard from Danielle about some things that might cause some anxiety during testing. You also heard from Kendra, our counselor, on some strategies to rein in that anxiety before, during, and after exams. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some effective ways to approach exam questions and answer options in a general sense, regardless of degree program. So let's get started. Okay, so this is where the bulk of my part of the presentation is going to focus on. Some effective versus less effective or ineffective approaches. So I'm going to start with some things that are good to do. This is my system of approaching questions. The first thing that I do is I make sure that I read the entire question, and I mean all of it. So I know that you guys, when you're in a test, you think, okay, I'm going to read my test question, but I'm sure that there have been times where you go back for exam review with your instructor and you're like, oh, I missed that word. That's really important. I can't believe I missed that word. Or, oh, I read that question wrong. So make sure you read your entire question. That's my first step every time. The second thing I do is I go back and I look, are there any key words in that question that I really need to focus on that are going to help me answer this correctly? So if I miss timing, first, last, those are really important. Absolute words, if you see something that says, what do you always do or never do, or what's the one thing that you're going to look for, those are very absolute. Also, prioritization. So if you see things that says, what's the most important or what's the least important, it's kind of a reverse prioritization. So timing and keywords, those are all very, very important. That's the second thing I do. The third thing I do after I look for keywords is I rephrase the question into my own words. And this is not taking the question and rereading the question again. This is taking those keywords that I found and figuring out, okay, what are they really asking me? And I rephrase it in my own words, because what that's going to do, that's going to really help you make sure that you're answering the question that they want you to answer. There's a lot of times where you go to answer a question that they're not actually asking you. So be careful and rephrase the question into your own words. The next thing I do is I think about the pathophysiology or the actual content of the question. What are they actually talking to me about? I think about that ahead of time. If it was a fill in the blank, what would I write? So I think about that very briefly, and then I go and I look at my answer options, and I read every single one of them all the way through. I read every single word. When you're in a higher stress environment, your brain, especially if you're having anxiety, is having a fight or flight response. And you know what happens with that? Your body thinks that it's getting chased by a bear or a tiger or a lion. Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! Oh, welcome to me. Welcome to my tutoring. But your body thinks there's a physical threat. There's no physical threat. It's an emotional threat. And so it wants to get out of that situation fast. And so you may not realize you're doing this, but you're kind of skimming the question, or you're reading very quickly. And that's why slowing yourself down and having this process is really important. Reading fully and carefully, very important. Then, after I've read my answer options, I use the process of elimination. This is where your content knowledge comes in. This is where your critical thinking comes in. This is where weighing what is the question asking versus what is this answer answering? Does it align together? And then the last thing I do, if I'm stuck, I use test taking strategies. So if you have not looked into test taking strategies, you have some good stuff on ATI. If you don't have access to ATI, if you're in a program that doesn't use it, then don't worry about that. But I do have a test taking strategies presentation on our CSS YouTube channel. If you go to the CSS D2L site, there is a direct link to those, and you can go take a look at those. That will help you. Those are for last resort. If you're like, I don't have any idea what the question is asking, I've never heard of that content before, and then you look through your answer options and you're like, oh, I don't really know what that is. That's when you would use some strategies. Everything else leading up to that is you knowing your stuff and critical thinking. So some ineffective approaches are kind of all opposite of that. So skimming your question, reading through it really quickly, not identifying your keywords, which then you end up missing your keywords, not really knowing or focusing on what exactly the test question is asking, not relying on your own content knowledge. So what can happen sometimes is you see a word that's familiar and you're like, oh, I know what that word is, or I've seen that word in my notes before, instead of actually focusing on what do I know? You know, what have I learned? If I don't know what this concept is, can I pick out a core prefix or a suffix or a stem? Does it lead back to something I learned in anatomy and physiology? I lean so much on my anatomy and physiology when I am doing my test questions, because medical terminology, anatomy and physiology, they are all so important to your overall success, not only in school, but in your career. And you're going to find that out, especially if you really focus in on some of those things while you're, going along in your program, whatever program you're in. Choosing an answer because it's familiar or vice versa, not choosing an answer because you've never seen it before. So I've done a lot of exam reviews with students, and one of the things that I see very often and that I've heard very often is, well, I just chose that answer because I remember being on the same page as my notes for another subject, so I figured it just went with that other subject. So you're choosing an answer because it was on the same page as another content area, not because you thought that was the right answer because of the content itself. So don't just choose something because it is or it isn't familiar. Choose something because you have weighed the options and you thought about it and it makes sense or it doesn't make sense and you've eliminated it. So the last thing that people make a mistake is not having a plan in place for when they are like, well, I don't know the answer. So that's really important for the strategy part, to get that in place. So with that being said, practice, and then practice some more, and then do it again. So here are some different websites or ideas that can give you some really good practice questions. So your textbook, turns out it is useful, not only for content, but for practicing. So the more that you can do practice questions, let's just back up a second. The more that you can do practice questions in a quote safe environment, in a non-testing environment, in a time frame where you're not having anxiety and fight or flight responses, you can take the things that we've talked about here, that Danielle and that Kendra and myself have talked about, and practice those strategies in advance so that you are much better prepared for when that higher stakes time frame comes around. So practice as much as you can. I highly recommend getting in and doing practice questions. So your textbook, they usually have back of the chapter questions. Sometimes the answers are in the index, not the index, the appendix is in the back. Sometimes you have to go to the online companion website, which is another area where you can find really, really amazing practice questions and extra study tools in general. If you have ATI, if you use ATI in your program, the ATI books have a lot of good questions in them. Usually they're 5 to a chapter. The ATI website is full of practice questions. You have the learning systems. You have the adaptive quizzes that you can access from inside the learning systems area. You have the targeted quizzes. If you're an internship, you have board vitals. There's questions in skills modules. There's questions everywhere. If you have the RN Mentor app, if you happen to get that before they took that off, there's lots of good practice questions within ATI. The library, contact our librarian because she has so many phenomenal resources for practice questions, online ebooks, prep books, you name it. She has so many awesome resources that you're never going to know exist unless you go and you reach out to her. So practice, practice, and do it some more. Awesome. All right. So now you've got some information about test anxiety, some tips on how to tackle that, and some tips on how to tackle test questions. So we have enjoyed doing this for you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We really like helping out. It's the whole reason we're here. My contact information is on the slide. Again, my name is Melissa Williams. I'm our nursing coordinator from the Center for Student Success, and my email address is mwilliams@methodistcoll.edu. Thank you for tuning in, and don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.